So, welcome everyone this evening to this conversation sponsored by St. Joseph's College Center for Faith and Spirituality on faith and politics. My name is Chris Fuller, and I am the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer at St. Joseph's College. And my guests this evening represent, I guess we'd say the focus tonight would be the Abrahamic traditions in conversation about the relationship between discerning our faith traditions and our civic life, and especially with regard to upcoming elections. And so my guests this evening are Bishop Robert Deeley, Bishop of Portland, Maine, Suzanne Lafreniere, who is the policy advisor to Bishop Deeley and the Diocese of Portland, Reverend Jane Field, who is the executive director of the Maine Council of Churches, Rabbi Carolyn Braun, who is the rabbi at Temple Beth in Portland, and Pious Ali, who is councilman for the city of Portland. My thanks to all of you for joining us this evening for this conversation. I want to also make clear as part of this conversation that my guests not only represent a variety of faith traditions, but also relationships to those traditions. That is, Bishop Deeley represents the Catholic Church, a tradition that documents its teachings for dissemination to its adherents throughout the United States and, of course, throughout the world. My other guests represent particular denominations, if you will, within their traditions. So they don't speak in the same kind of way, perhaps, as Bishop Deeley might, in terms of they don't speak for all of Islam, all of Judaism, all of Protestant Reformed Christianity, but they will in fact speak either from their own particular traditions or from their own particular experiences here in their communities in Portland. So I think it's important to make that distinction known as we begin this conversation. And so before we begin, I'm going to start our time together with this brief prayer. Let us pray for all the election judges, poll watchers, and voters, that we may have safe and welcoming voting places. Tens of thousands of volunteers help run our elections across the nation. Let us be sure to pray for them and thank them. Let us vote. As people of faith, we are called to engage in the world, as messy as that may be at times. Voting is a privilege and a responsibility. This has been a contentious election season. Regardless of who wins, let us encourage healing and reconciliation across lines of faith, race, and politics. We share the hope and belief in the goodwill and compassion for the common good, well-being of everyone, as we work toward this goal of healing and reconciliation. On November 3rd, let us pray and vote. On November 4th, let us pray and begin the work of healing and reconciliation in our country. Amen. And so the question that I sent out to each of our panelists to prepare for the first part of this conversation has to do with the principles, teachings, guidelines within each of their traditions that they draw upon in terms of making decisions about or determinations about participation in civic life, and in particular with regard to elections. So each of our participants this evening will have up to 10 minutes that they'll kind of respond to that question. And then we'll kind of open the evening up to those who would like to ask any questions. If you have a particular question, those of you at St. Joseph's College can see on your screen the email account you can send your question into. That is CFS, for Center for Faith and Spirituality, CFS at sjcme.edu. If you're watching the live stream on Facebook, add a comment in if you wish, and I'll be curating questions and pose them to our participants. And so our first response by Carolyn.
So first of all, oh look, I can see people. This is great. So thank you very much for inviting me. This is pretty exciting. And I have also come into the 21st century, so I didn't even print out my notes. I'm looking at it on my computer. My prayer is that it all works out well. So I could begin with some teachings that you all know, like Lahavta et reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, or you should show kindness to the stranger, for you too were a stranger in a strange land, Or we are created b'tselem Elohim. We are all created in the image of God, and so we should imitate the divine. Those are all good teachings, but I decided I wanted to look at something that maybe I haven't spoken a lot about, and that is the word chesed. So I have some text around this word chesed. So you might be asking yourselves, what is chesed? Something that I have asked myself also. It's a very difficult, it's actually a difficult word to translate. And when I was working, I was at Mount Holyoke College as the Jewish chaplain, and the Catholic chaplain and I spoke all the time about theology. And we were trying to figure out what this word chesed meant. So it is sometimes translated as loving kindness, steadfast love, compassion, mercy, and our conversations were constantly around grace. Maybe it's closest to something like grace or mercy. It's very hard to define, but it's all those things. But one of the things we know about this word chesed is that it is an action. It's relational. It's something that we do for someone else. And we also know that it is one of God's primary attributes. It's expressed in the Kabbalah. It's also expressed throughout Torah. And in fact, there's a teaching that says the Torah, those first five books of the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah begins with loving kindness and ends with loving kindness. And what that refers to is the rabbis saw when God clothed Adam and Eve when they found themselves naked in the garden, that was an act of chesed. And at the end of the Torah, when Moses died, God helped to bury Moses, and that was an act of chesed. And so God's two acts on either side of the Torah says that we begin with loving kindness and end with loving kindness. The verse that I want to reflect on for a minute is actually from Psalms. And it says, Ki amarti olam chesed yibaneh. As I have said, presumably as God has said, the world is built with chesed. The world is built with this concept of loving kindness, compassion, steadfast love, grace, mercy. And you know, Judaism is a very interpretive religion. There is the words of the Torah, but since the destruction of the temple, we have reinterpreted it to become what we call rabbinic Judaism. And in rabbinic Judaism, the rabbis, the sages, up until today, interpret the text. In the 10th century, there was a thing called Musar, which is their instructions for how to live a meaningful and ethical life. And teachings that were first personal and then communal. So there's this rabbi, Rav Shlomo Wolbe, who is actually, he was born in 1914, he died in 2005, so he had a ton of wisdom. And he was reflecting on this verse, the world is built on chesed. The world is built on your love, is what he said. And he says, every act of chesed, even a small one, is an actual act of building and creation, enlivening the spirit of the downtrodden and the brokenhearted. So every time we perform an act of chesed, an act of compassion, an act of mercy, an act of building up, we are literally building the world. And then he has an example. He says, when the Blessed Holy One created humanity in the divine image, God did not only give of God's glory to humanity, adorning us with qualities of intellect and soul. So we didn't only get intellect and soul from God, but God also gave us the power of a radiant face. So what does this mean, a radiant face? So probably you all know that priestly blessing, may God bless you and keep you. May God's face shine upon you. May God look upon you favorably with chesed. And in the radiance of the human face is a hidden treasure of blessing and mercy. Then he says, from the quality of the radiant face, a concrete behavior flows. And this is the quality of Shammai the elder, who said, receive every person with a kind face. So where are we now? What I'm saying is, in this world, especially as we come into this election, but really all the time, the principle is to greet everyone with a kind face, but they go even deeper. Of course, we're Jewish, we have to go deeper. So, a kind face, it says in Pirkei Avot, which is another ethical teaching, you should judge all people with the scale weighted in his or her favor. In other words, whenever we meet a person, we look for the absolute best in them because there is something that is best in them. Know that a person must judge everyone favorably, even someone who is completely, in this case it says wicked, but I would change that to say, even somebody who absolutely does not hold our political beliefs, even someone who we think maybe doesn't deserve some benefit or another. No, we need to look at that person and see that they are, see where their goodness lies, where the essence of God lies in them. And if we judge them in that way, they will rise to a good place. So during this time, during these polarized times, it can be easy for us to look upon those who disagree or with disdain or as the enemy or refuse to speak to one another. And we might look at those people who suffer as somehow deserving it, or not my problem, or I have my own problems. But we can't do that. Our teaching says our task is to channel God's chesed, God's very mercy, compassion, loving kindness, looking at each one of us positively. We have to channel that and bring that to the next person, because the world is built with chesed. The world is built with this idea, and every time we take away a piece of chesed, we begin to destroy the world. And I believe that we see that happening every time we bring violence upon the world. We bring violence upon a person. Then we are ruining the world. So I want to end with this same rabbi says, this is a great thing. What the rabbis called giving peace. People can't hear me.
That's we can hear you.
Okay. He says that what the rabbis called giving peace is not merely rhetorical flourish. One who offers a kind face to another literally gives peace to the other. For this reason, Rabbi Matya ben Harash said, "Be the first to give the greeting of shalom to every person." So in answer to your question, if we base all our actions on chesed, I think that that we all come to a much higher place and a much more positive place and a much more productive and life-giving place.
Thank you, Rabbi Braun. Next, we have Bishop Deeley and Suzanne Lafreniere.
Thank you, Chris, and let me thank you for the invitation to be with this illustrious group of people. What I want to talk about first, if I can, is to follow on what Carolyn has just said and giving a beautiful description of Hesed, and say that to me, what I think we should, what I want to start with is that voting is Hesed itself. It's not just the motivation which guides us, but it is voting is a good. And I think that's the first principle for us as Catholics, that we are called to participate in the common life. And that includes government, and that includes participation in the political life. And so voting is Hesed. Voting is a good thing. Voting is an act in which we should participate. That's the first thing. In one of his letters, the Holy Father, Pope Francis, tells us we need to participate for the common good. He says sometimes we hear that a good Catholic is not interested in politics, and this is not true. Good Catholics immerse themselves in politics by offering the best of themselves so that the leader can govern. Politics and participation in that is important to us as Catholics. It's not something we should take lightly. It's an important obligation we have to the common good to participate in this process. And so I think that's the first thing. So then the question comes down to, well, how do we go about that? How do we decide how we're going to participate? And there, the bishops in the United States spend a lot of time on helping people to understand, and we have wonderful documentation in on the website, both of the Diocese of Portland and also of the United States Catholic Bishops Conference, on a document which is called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. And that gives some guidelines to people so that they might know how it is that they might exercise this responsibility that they have to vote. You'll note that it talks about what this panel is all about forming consciences. So I think it would be helpful to say something about what it means to speak about an informed conscience and how that informs the decisions that we make. Now, conscience, first of all, it's not something that just allows us to justify doing something. We often say, well, my conscience is telling me this, that, or the other thing. Conscience is not just a mere feeling good about what we should or should not do. Conscience for us is the voice of God, resounding in our human heart, telling us, revealing to us the truth, and calling us to do what is good while shunning what is evil. So it is something that is within us, but it's really without us. It's outside of us in the sense that it takes us outside of ourselves into the good of the community within which we live, the values of that community, the teachings of that community, so that we reflect on those, and those help us to form the judgment that we're going to make in terms of conscience. So voting is a decision of conscience. Conscience must be informed and moral judgment enlightened. A well-formed conscience is upright and truthful, the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us. So now we're all confronted with all kinds of situations in life which are gray areas and dilemmas and so on. And we have to make moral judgments in those. And so the way we do that is to seek seriously what is the right and the good, and to discern the will of God as expressed in divine law, so that we understand who we are in relation to one another. So I think that I would summarize that there are three things that we need to think about in terms of voting, and things which go into the principles, and they're very similar to what Carolyn talked about. First of all, there's respect for the dignity of the human person. That's the core of Catholic social and moral teaching. The Catholic Church teaches that human life is sacred. And in our teaching, that is from conception to natural death. And the dignity of the human person is the foundation of a moral vision for society. So that's the foundation of all the other principles of our social life. So life is among the first of those rights, and the condition for all the other rights of the person. But our concern in this regard, therefore, begins with the unborn, but equally sacred, Pope Francis tells us, the lives of the poor, those already born, the destitute, the abandoned, the underprivileged, the vulnerable, infirm, and elderly exposed to covert euthanasia, the victims of human trafficking, new forms of slavery, and every form of rejection. Now, in making the decision in conscience, according to that principle of the human being, we talked first of all about the common good, not about our own personal interests. How can we make the world a better place? That's the grounding for making a decision in conscience. Not how can I improve my own personal situation, but how can I make the world a better place? we are called to go into the world to proclaim the good news to the whole of creation. And then the final thing is we have an obligation, a responsibility, and a true obligation to, as I started, with forming our consciences and participating in the civil life of the nation. That's the only way we're going to get to the kind of thing we want, which is that responsible decisions which are made not for our own benefit only, but also for the good of the common good, and for thinking about what it is that is best for the society in which we live. We're all called to prayerful, active, and responsible participation in the political process. And so registering and voting is an obligation, and is an important part of our Christian commitment. Now, I want to let Suzanne finish off the thoughts and add anything that she wanted to say to this.
Thanks, Bishop. I think your audio, for some reason, is sometimes in, sometimes out, just so you know, in the question and answer session. If you lean in, maybe it'll help. I think the most important thing to remember, really, based on this, is that elections happen every year. And it seems like the most, it seems like every presidential cycle, everyone says it's the most important election of my lifetime. Well, I'm not that old. How many most important elections could there have been in my lifetime? And that really civic responsibility and being a faithful citizen, no matter what your faith is something that we need to do with the other 364 days a year. So if that means praying for your legislator, making sure you know who your legislator is, it's not just a one-time, I fill in the ballots kind of thing, stick it in, and I've done my duty. Really, the work is done during the other 364 days a year. So I would really encourage those who are watching or those who might watch later the stream to really get involved. Most faith communities in Maine have some sort of way to get involved. If you're Catholic, obviously it's through my office at the Office of Public Policy at the Diocese, but really as excited and passionate and difficult and a presidential election cycle can be, it can be just as wonderful to work in policy and in faithful citizenship the rest of the year. So I would encourage those who are interested in it to do so.
Thank you, Suzanne. Now we have Reverend Field.
Thanks, Chris. I really want to thank you for the opportunity to be with my friends on this call and get to listen to them. And you're going to hear a lot of overlap. Pious, by the time we get to you, I hope that we haven't left everything said, that there's still things for you to talk about. I bet there will be. So I apologize for the echo effect. Much of what Bishop and Carolyn said, I'll be talking about too. But I want to start with my own particularity, because I think that shapes our faith and our lens through which we see faith as well as political decisions. So I do stand, as you said, in the Christian community on the Protestant branch of the family tree. And in particular, the leaf I'm on is Presbyterian, which is the Scottish version of the Protestant Reformation. I'm white, that's probably obvious. Cisgender, straight woman. I was born and raised in the late 20th century. I hope that's obvious. My daughter would probably say I look like I was born in the 17th century, but that's not fair. I've lived all of my life in the United States, and socioeconomically would situate myself as middle class and a homeowner. And you could take everything I just said and use one word, and it's privilege. And when we have privilege, it can distort the lens that we see our faith through, and certainly that we see political decisions through. So it's really important to be mindful, self-aware, and other-aware. So with all that said, as a good child of the Reformation, there are basically three big influences that I want to name. The first is the Bible. The motto of the Reformation was sola scriptura, so we turn to the Bible first, last, and in between. We look to the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures for insight and challenge, for authority. When I got ordained, I vowed that it would be a unique and authoritative witness to my life. And it is definitely the authority that we seek information and wisdom about Jesus of Nazareth. But I want to be clear that in saying all that, I don't take the Bible literally. I take it very seriously, but not literally, and there's a difference. The second source or influence is the Presbyterian Book of Confessions. That is part of our Constitution as a denomination, and it's a collection of documents that are as old as the Christian faith itself and then have been added to right up until present day, and they're considered our teachers. And then finally, I would name the community as an influence. We Presbyterians really take seriously the teaching that when 2 or 3 are gathered, then the Spirit is in the midst of them. The Greek word is in the in-between of them. And we believe that. So we believe in community, we make better decisions, we have greater clarity, and we're not meant to go it alone. We share our power equally in my tradition between laity and clergy when we discern and make decisions. And we make sure every voice is heard and that we're accountable to each other, both hierarchically and horizontally, so to speak, within the church. So within that Bible, that first influence, this is where the echo with Rabbi Braun is going to come in loud and clear. If you start at the very beginning, as Julie Andrews liked to say, with Genesis and humanity being made in the image of God, for me, when I look at political decisions or go into a voting booth, it's to remember that every person in this community will be affected by my decisions, and every one of them is made in the image of God. So everybody counts, and there's no exception to that. And as you heard Rabbi say, Torah, the first 5 books of Hebrew scripture, is really clear that God is going to judge any society, including ours, by how the most vulnerable are treated. So widows, orphans, those living in poverty, strangers, refugees. And in Leviticus, as you heard Carolyn quote, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus quoted that in his own lifetime. And then we have the Hebrew prophets, I think my favorites, Isaiah, who talks about proclaiming good news to people who are oppressed, a release to people who are held captive, to have compassion for the brokenhearted. And the prophet Micah, who made it really simple, and that's good for me. I need simple. He said, you know what God requires of you. It's to do justice. And here comes, Carolyn, to love or to have hesed. I tend to translate that as to love with a fierce compassion, and to walk humbly, to have humility. And those things certainly are biblical influences on me. And then in the Christian scripture, there are 2 places that my mind immediately goes to. One was read at my own ordination, and it's Matthew 25. So if you feed someone who's hungry, clothe someone who's naked, visit someone in prison, you do it to the very least of these, Jesus said, you do it to him. And that's a really important influence in the decisions I make in the political arena. And the second is Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. It's been our lectionary this summer, well, into the fall. And so it's at the front of my mind. But he's sitting in a prison cell waiting to be executed and says, here are the things you need to think about in your life as a community, things that are honorable and honest and trustworthy and commendable. And then he says, and I think this is a real echo of what Carolyn was talking about, do nothing from selfishness or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourself. Don't look to your own interests. And Bishop Deeley was talking about this just a moment ago, but look to the interests of others. So that reminds me of my favorite election year lawn sign. I know we've all been driving around Portland seeing all these creative signs, but this one's my favorite. And you've probably seen it, but big letters at the top says vote as if. And then there's all these lines underneath. Vote as if your skin is not white. Your parents need medical care. Your spouse is an immigrant. Your land is on fire. Your child is transgender. Your house is flooded. Your sister is a victim of gun violence. Your brother is gay. Your water is unsafe. And then at the bottom it says, because privilege has no place in an election, but empathy does. And Reverend Rabbi Braun, I think we should cross out empathy and put Hesed. Hesed belongs in an election. And Jim Rice wrote about this in Sojourners. If you haven't seen this month's Sojourners, it's about the election and about faithful political activity. I would recommend it. In the Book of Confessions, I would say the Barmen Declaration. German Christians in 1934 wrote a confession saying that they opposed their government. And we all know who the government was in the 1930s in Germany. At least I hope we do, the Nazis. And then the other confession that I often look to is the Confession of 1967, which was a response to the Civil Rights Movement and talking about the importance of what we now call equity and inclusion. And then there's my community. That's my last influence. I take great comfort in being part of a community as I practice my faith, and they challenge me when I need to be challenged. They correct me when I'm wrong. I cannot imagine trying to sort out political decision-making without them and without my colleagues from other faiths whom I treasure, like Rabbi Braun and Pious Ali, who I'm really honored to be with here tonight. That's how I feel I can make the best decision possible in an election year, but like Suzanne said, all the other 364 days of the year too. Thanks again, Chris. I really appreciate this chance to talk.
Thank you, Reverend Field. Appreciate it. And so our last, but not least, participant this evening is Councilman Ali.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for making me part of this conversation. I am not a clergy, so it is an honor to be here with all of you. I'm a Muslim from Ghana. I heard something about Presbyterians, and so I went to what we call in Ghana a United Elementary School, which was built on the tradition of Methodist and Presby. How, I don't know. That is how I had my education. So I started reading the Bible before I actually became well-versed in the Quran. So it's glad to always hear things that I've read in the past. I read it once in a while now, being used in the public discourse. You don't see that much in this country. Anyway, Islam is literally the basis or the focus or the basic foundation of Islam is around justice and injustice. Like Judaism, there is rules on every day and every aspect of our lives. If you're going to eat, there's a prayer that you have to say to eat. If you're going to sleep, you say the sleeping prayer. If you wake up in the morning, you say the waking up in the morning prayer. If you shut the door before you go out, you say the leaving home. It goes on and on and on. And all of those prayers is indoors, it's internal, it's personal. And it doesn't matter where you live in the world, you live by those prayers. But there's one tweak which is interesting, that it doesn't matter which land you live in as a Muslim, you are guided in your personal everyday life by all those laws and regulations, and there's 100 of them. However, in the public, you are obliged as a Muslim to follow the laws of the land in which you live in. So it is an obligation on every Muslim to participate in the political process in every land, whether it is the land of your birth or the land that you chose to live in. And however, your participation should be based on justice. And you are expected to do all you can to make the government in that country, whether it is the community government, municipal, state, or the federal, or whatever it is that you live in, you are expected to participate in making sure that that government is ruled by people who are just. I did a couple of things that I'm going to look on. So if I'm not looking in the camera, it's because I'm trying hard to read what is on my screen. So in Islam, justice have many dimensions, and it is broadly defined. It's vertical. The vertical justice is between us as human being and God. And then there's the theological justice, which is a form of justice between human beings with ourselves, or a form of a social justice. And this includes everything from macro level of politics to economic dimensions, to personal interactions, and then with your friends, with your neighbors, and it goes on and on. And the Quranic term that best explains this social justice is the Arabic term, which Qist, Qist, which means fairness. It entails a sense of equality and justice in the distribution and share of social projects to ensure that all members of society receive their fair share of that, what that society, whether it is in a town or in a community. If you have a resources, Islam entails you to make sure that people, like how we have the safety net, to make sure that everybody who lives within that jurisdiction have some sort of like a safety net. That is how the political Islam, or the principles on which Muslims are supposed to participate in politics. It also entails the fair governance of people according to mutual consultation, which is that we have a charter at city level, we have the constitution at state and federal level, that this is how we have all collectively agreed to rule ourselves. And so if we put people in leadership role, we have to make sure they are following that written document, which we all collectively agree to. And if you have to select those people, like we are going to do now in an election year, we have to look and see who is running and what are their values. Do they reflect the values that guide me as a Muslim, which is fairness and just? Are they going to create and lead in a fairness way, or in a just way where they treat each other equally? There is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, about the virtues of a leader. That says that the virtues of a just leader is assigned in a paradise for one who rules with just. The Prophet also declared that the most noble struggle is to speak a truthful word in the presence of tyrannical rule. This sentiment is a powerful motivation for political activism and human rights for Muslims. During the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he heard an incident that happened in Abyssinia, which is the modern day Ethiopia, that an elderly woman was pushed, and the Prophet responded and said, how will God sanctify a nation that does not protect its underprivileged from its powerful? And so Muslims all over the world, or in this country, or in my community, or me, that is how we look at people who are going to lead us. That is how we decide who are we going to support during elections, or even if it is to select leaders in a group that we belong to, or in the community that we live in. Who is it that will be that leader? Who will make sure that the weak, the poor are protected from the powers of people who have more power and will use it in a tyrannical way? In Islam is a fundamental faith of activism. The Quran said that, or the Prophet said that whoever witnessed something evil, let him change it with his hand. And if he is unable, then with his tongue. And if he is unable, then with his heart. And then he said that is the weakest form of faith. If you cannot change it in your heart with your hands, meaning you have to physically interrupt that injustice, or you cannot yell and stop that injustice from going on, and you can only say in your heart, I wish this is not happening. That is the weakest, but it is better than not doing anything at all. Muslims are not expected to be bystanders when injustice is going on. We are expected to step in, to stop it, and make sure that everyone is treated fairly and in a just way. Well, thank you. And I think a lot of us on this call live by that values, which means that we believe that every society should be a just society. And those who are watching us, I hope that this year, if you go out to vote, whether it is for school board members, city councillors, state legislatures, or federal elected officials, have that in mind, that all we want is a just society when everyone is giving their share of what our country provides.
Thank you, Councilman. So, something there are distinctive, obviously, perspectives that each tradition brings, but what I hear in common are, right, a concern for the public good, or the common good, particularly with those who are the most vulnerable, right? And each tradition seems to have its own kind of, as I described earlier, documentary heritage, but in different kinds of ways, right? The Catholic Church having its own tradition of teaching, the centrality of the Bible, as you mentioned, Reverend Field, and the Confessions, and Councilman Ali, your reference to the Quran, and yours to the tradition of Chesed, right? So they would each come at this angle, but kind of similarities and concerns. So a question that I had relative to this, and is starting with these principles that guide us, how do you then, either in your ministerial roles or just your role as a practicer of the faith, in your relationship with others who practice your faith, how do you, if they come to you and ask you, how do I put these principles into practice? Can you give me some guidelines for how I can make sense of these traditions of my faith in terms of forming my conscience, thinking about the common good? How do you advise someone, either again in your ministerial role or just a practitioner of the faith, to a fellow member of your faith tradition? Yes, Suzanne.
Well, I guess I'll go first. Chris, I think I get that question a lot, some version of that question a lot, just because of what people know that I do as a profession. And it's less intimidating, I think, to ask me than to ask their priest, their pastor, their deacon. And oftentimes I have to ask them, well, what have you read lately? Do you know Catholic social teaching at all besides, a couple of lines? I don't ask them to do what I did when I first started doing this, which is go all the way back to Pope Leo XIII and start with Rerum Novarum, the encyclical. But I do say you can't get Catholic social teaching, and you can't get the truth, the good, the beautiful based on watching news. You can't get that based on watching, CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. And people who really want to form their conscience, I say you have to do the reading, and then you have to bring it to prayer. And people who are very addicted to the political cycle, who are addicted to the news cycle, that kind of thing, I recommend, and I just say, listen, I'm not ordained at all, but as much time as you spend watching whatever news you like, spend that much time in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament or in private prayer, because it's very easy to get wrapped up and think you're forming your conscience. And I accuse myself of that as well. I definitely convict myself of that sometimes. It's very easy to think that you are forming your conscience correctly, but really you're only kind of thinking about your own previous political priors, and you're going back to what your biased view would be ahead of time. So I think you have to know and go back to the Bible. You have to go back to the teachings of the church and then bring it to prayer, because you're never going to be able to form your conscience just watching a news cycle. That's what I recommend to people. And I'm giving that kind of elevator speech to people who are calling me all the time right now. I'm wondering what to do.
Thank you, Suzanne. It makes me think also that I think each of our traditions has some form of the value of fasting. And for myself as a Catholic, 1 year for fasting, I gave up news commentary. And in giving it up, I realized how beholden I had become to it, and how much I had surrounded myself actually with commentary that simply reinforced in an echo chamber things I wanted to hear, instead of hearing things, other points of view, right? Or turning to other sources of information, try to understand and make sense out of the issue. So I would add that too, maybe the tradition, all of our traditions, the tradition of fasting, that might have some role also relative to your point about our news and our news cycle. Yes. Anyone else would like to add? Yes.
I guess so it's an interesting question, and there's a question that I was going to ask of all of us too, which is, so Jews don't tend to come and ask their rabbi when
Neither.
that's the first thing. But sometimes I'm able to teach some sort of a basic, like, as weird as this sounds, but for example, Jews believe that birth happens at birth, or that life happens at birth and not earlier. It's just a teaching. So I can at least, put forth a teaching, and I believe that that Jews do look at our Passover experience, and where it says that we are supposed to feel as if we are slaves, and therefore, often when you have that kind of empathy, you can make other decisions. But what's interesting about this, as I said, Jews don't tend to come to me, but rather it is very difficult to talk about these issues in the context of the synagogue. And that's one of the challenges we are working through right now, that certainly everyone has an opinion, and everyone, often they will share their opinion, but I tend to work on how we speak to each other, because that for us is where we, I think, fall down. That that what people will see as a political statement and what I don't feel as a political statement, we just have a hard time talking about these issues, and they're so central, as you have brought up, Chris. That's why we're here. And so that's where it's difficult, at least for me, in my community.
Jane? Yeah.
Yeah, I resonate with that, Carolyn. As Suzanne was talking, I know there's something in the Bible about not coveting, right? I remember reading that. I'm coveting the fact that people call you and ask you. In Protestant land over here, more often you're going to hear, keep politics out of the pulpit, keep politics out of my church. It shouldn't belong here. And the lectionary on Sunday was render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, and render unto God what's God's. And nobody has sent me nasty grams in the email yet, but I preach politics, but not partisan politics. We were talking about GOP and Democrat. We were talking about, what's stamped on the coin is Caesar, but what's stamped on us is the image of God. And so you're called to go vote, remembering that about everybody in your community. And I know people were like, oh, Lord, is she done yet? Like, can we move on? Because it makes them very uncomfortable. Good for you that I'm so jealous that they call and ask.
So I want to take that and kind of turn it a little bit and pose a question for you, Bishop Deeley, which is, I would imagine in your role within the Catholic Church as a teacher of the faith, people will perhaps come to you and say, Bishop Deeley, tell me how to vote. And how do you respond to those questions when people might come to you and say, well, you're the bishop, tell me how to vote? How do you counsel them in those kinds of circumstances?
Actually, Chris, the question I get more often than that is, why aren't you telling them how to vote?
Okay.
It's not a question of how to vote. Though I do get that, and the same question that Suzanne gets. And it is important that we are not. We don't tell people how to vote. And I think there was a past in which, Cardinal Cushing down in Boston would stand up and say, vote for this one or that one or the other one. Those days are long gone, and they weren't helpful. They didn't help people to really form a conscience and an awareness of what's happening. So I continue to do the same kinds of things. I do preach, but I'm very careful not to bring it to specifics or to and make sure that I stay out of political parties. And if people like what I'm saying, they will affirm it. If they think it was going in one way or the other, which is not the way they want it to go, then they will attack. I get letters on both sides. I really do every day in this period of time. Tell them how to vote, and so I try to stick to what it is that, you know, bringing their attention to the documents that we do have, which are very helpful. I mean, we've done a lot of work over 20 years on that document, and keep on refining every 4 years. Because it's a national conference, obviously, the national election becomes the one that we make. So, I think there's good guidance for people. I love Suzanne's thing about, you know, helping people to look at the social teaching of the church. We have an encyclopedia of the social teaching of the church, so you can get it all in one volume. You don't have to go to all kinds of different places.
And then, Councilman Ali, in your own tradition, in terms of what role does the imam play a role in terms of how one might in providing counsel or guidance, or is it more among the community in terms of these kinds of conversations?
So I have a very unwritten relationship with the imams. They've asked me to stay out of their mosques with my political rhetoric. So I'm doing just that. And we also agree. I tell them that I'm not an imam. So when there's the need for imam, you guys need to go. I tend to have people coming to me. Literally, there are people who will call me if they have their ballot in front of them. Yeah, they will be in the voting room. They'll say, I'm here. I have no understanding earlier. And as time goes on, I started asking myself, am I being fair to this person by saying vote for this or vote for that? So what I started doing is, because Islam is like all of the other faiths, is not monolithic. We have a very wide spectrum, from people who agree with me and to others who don't agree with me. I am lucky I don't have to preach to them every week. I just stay in my lane. Once in a while, I will send out email about something to the community, and I will receive a response that says that, don't send me these kind of things anymore. And I know what that meant. And so I will not send it to this particular person when it is that type of things. However, during elections, what I do, even if I endorse someone, I do send emails out, but specifically to the Muslim community, especially the leaders. What I do is I will write something that describes each how do we call it, each person that they are going to vote on, whether it is from the newspaper or me writing something, and then send it out to them, and then they will decide on who they want to support, because I know that they are not most of the time they will see me and other leaders publicly supporting someone. Maybe that is a form of guidance for the community. But when it comes to individual, how do we call it, decision making, because I want to have a good working relationship with everyone, I try as much as I can not to impose my personal view to someone who will come to me and ask me, who should I vote for? I will explain everyone to them if I have the time. If not, I will say that I sent something to the imam, go to the imam, and then he will, yeah. So I do get that. And I'm glad, like I said, I don't have to preach to anyone every weekend. Yeah.
I have a confession to make, Pious, that when I'm looking at my ballot and the newspapers and making my decisions, I often look to see who you endorse. And so your word carries weight, my friend.
True that.
Oh.
So we have just a few minutes left. So this is a question I was thinking during a conversation, which is, we all know and recognize our culture is very polarized right now, and I think it's very tempting to do as I had once done, right before I took that fast, which is to kind of fall into our own kind of echo chambers, just reinforce how we feel because we have this opinion about this candidate or this issue or this particular thing. Do you have any kind of advice, again, either from your own personal perspective or your tradition for our viewers in terms of this election is not going to be the end of it, right? There is what comes after the election. And in terms of, as people of faith, your advice, your counsel as far as moving forward from this election, right? In terms of the polarized times we find ourselves in. Yes, Carolyn.
I just want to say this because I'm a little bit proud of it, and bragging is not a very good thing, but I feel braggadocious about it, or whatever the word is. And it's not only it's not what comes after is going to be very important, but what comes before is almost more important. And my bragging is that I have a very dear friend who holds the absolute opposite political stance as I do on almost every on many issues. And I once considered saying, well, how can we have these conversations? And I love this person, and so I have remained in the conversation with him, even when I feel a little insulted. We'll talk. I'll say, don't say that. I'm insulted, or whatever. But being engaged with somebody right now, or people that you disagree with, is probably the best advice I have, because I think that's how I came to that idea of chesed and looking at each person, because we're going to have to talk to each other afterwards. And some of us are going to be disappointed, and some of us are going to be less disappointed, and some are going to be ecstatic. And however it falls, we all are going to have to look at each other and work together. So it's the preparation. This is a bad example almost, but it's when people come to me right before they're dying to talk about their relationship with God. Better now than never, but it would have helped if you worked on that earlier, and then you'll enter into this next part of your life in with more peace.
Yes, Bishop.
Chris, I think that is a good question, but I think we need to put the answer, to my mind, into a larger context, because I think that this is not only about an election. We can't miss the state of the world, the state of that the coronavirus is causing in our world, the anxiety, the lack of patience, the isolation, and all of those kinds of factors, which, to my mind, makes it even more important that we work towards getting people to worship and to bring them together into communities. I think that I have been trying to encourage the governor to give us some leeway so we can do this safely. Now, we have been worshiping since June safely, but I mean, if we though there are ways in which we can gather the community for worship, we can also gather them for good works. And the way in which we move beyond division is to work together on accomplishing something, putting food into bags around a table, to knit clothes for poor kids, to get involved in activities which are a way to strengthen our parish communities, and in that way, as Carolyn says, getting to deepen our relationships, deepen our appreciation for each other as human beings, and that's the whole principle on which all of our political things will. And that's the only way in which, because we're going to remain polarized if we don't bring people together. But we're not going to bring people together if we say, all right, we're going to have the Democrats on this side and Republicans on that side, and we're going to do it over something which is common. Our faith is in our different traditions. Our faith is what we have in common. Our faith calls us to do good for others. Let's find ways to do that so that we can move things forward.
Thank you, Bishop. And anyone else?
Well, I will just do. Oh, okay, I'm not muted. I will just to add that I think conversations like this need to be held both online and if COVID willing, things change in public spaces where people from different backgrounds will see that it is possible to engage people even if you don't even if you don't agree. I also think that faith leaders need to start speaking to most public spaces, like the media, to say that they need to tone down the divisive rhetoric, as much as speaking or preaching, bringing people together when in the pulpit, on during prayers, because as the rabbi said, it is not just after the election. It is a continuous thing. We didn't get here overnight. I think there's a lot of work ahead, and one of the many ways that we can bridge the gap and the differences in our country is by publicly bringing faith and civic leaders who do not necessarily agree with each other to start engaging in the respective conversation like this. That will be helpful.
And Jane or Suzanne, any thoughts here at the end? Good. Okay. Well, I think of my own Christian tradition too. There's a saying that's often attributed to St. Augustine, but he actually comes more from the Middle Ages, which is in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, freedom, and in all things, charity. And so it sounds like that those are the things we might want to keep in mind as we move forward. I want to thank each of our panelists for joining us tonight, Bishop Deeley, Suzanne, Lafreniere, hope I said that right, Reverend Jane Field, Councilman Pious Ali, and Rabbi Carolyn Braun. Thank you for making time for me tonight and for this conversation. Have a good evening. Thank you for all the work you do in this community and for all the good you do for the people of Maine and Portland.